Thanks again so much to Corey Jackson for joining us this evening. Our event tonight, as we said before, is co-hosted by the sister meetups, both based in Melbourne, Australia, the Philosopher's Bazaar and Philosophy Matters. Corey will talk tonight on Buddhism and science, differing technologies for mental health. What can 2,500 years of striving for Buddhist enlightenment tell us about mental health in the 21st century? Is there a place for science in the path to enlightenment and a place for Buddhist views in the scientific attempt to understand the mind? In this session, Corey will discuss why Buddhists still get angry, why psychology can't cure anxiety or depression, and how to strive for long-term mental health while still reaping short-term rewards. A little about our speaker. Corey Jackson is a PhD candidate researching the underlying causes of anxiety, depression, and emotional dysfunction. His research is the culmination of a degree in psychology and Sanskrit, plus more than 20 years studying and translating Buddhist philosophy from Tibetan to English. Comfortable in a research lab or mountain monastery, Corey's work and research sits at the intersection of scientific and contemplative tradition. These days, he works as a meditation teacher, emotion and stress management coach. Before any of this, he was a jazz pianist in Toronto, Canada. We'd like to warmly welcome Corey and invite you to present, followed by some Q&A. There may or may not be questions about offering a recital this evening. That's up to the audience. Thank you, Corey.
All right, no worries. Thank you, Akiva and everyone. Well, it's funny to hear that stuff read out to me because it's sort of like, I mean, it's basically promotional material that I've written at some point in the deep, distant past. Yeah, it's added extra level of pressure. So, yeah, well, what I have here is basically a synthesis of a larger program. I've just finished a 6-part series, so I have 9 hours worth of material, and we ran out of time, to really flesh it out, to be honest. So what I plan to do is get through, sort of go fairly quickly through a few concepts and ideas, in the hope that maybe, that you might have some questions about it. So rather than deep dive into one aspect, I thought I might just give you a few different approaches, and then if you have some other questions, we can, sort of flesh that out more. If not, I have plenty of material. So let me just share my screen. Oh, I should also say that I don't really have an agenda. Like usually when I'm presenting, I have like all sorts of agendas, depending on what I want from a crowd. Tonight is just kind of, it's a bit random. I happen to know Will for some time. We both live up here on the Sunshine Coast, and he asked me to come along, and I just sort of said yes. So I don't, I'm not here to sort of, I guess if I had to have an agenda, it would be that if some of this, you find some of this interesting, or you think that maybe some of this might even help, if you like, yourself or people then maybe just investigate further. That would be the extent of it. So let's have a look. I will share my screen. So I already got a little introduction from Akiva, so I'll just, again, go through this fairly quickly. It's true, I was a musician, mostly I actually started in Brisbane, but I moved to Canada. And while I was in Toronto, I really wanted to learn. I was looking for a secret weapon. I needed more gigs. I wanted to make more money, play piano better. And I was in the middle of a performance degree, and I thought paying attention might help. If I could pay better attention, then my time would be better spent, And so I poked around and I looked into different approaches, some psychological, some a little bit weird, to be honest. But there's a lot of Tibetans in Toronto, and I went to hear what they had to say, and I tried out what they were suggesting, just in terms of training my attention. I wasn't really interested in Buddhist stuff very much. And I was really sort of interested that as I put into practice what they were saying, I saw all these other benefits. So like I started to have like emotion regulation, and these, I had anxiety issues at the time that kind of dialed right down, and all this sort of stuff. So I got really interested. And so got so interested, I took off to India. I was in India for about 6 years, where I learned to speak, read, and write Tibetan. When I came back to Australia, I started translating for teachers who were here, mostly lectures, sometimes written, but mostly spoken lectures and interviews. Then I went to Sydney Uni. I did a degree in Sanskrit psychology, and now I'm up here on the Sunshine Coast researching a lot of how this intersection, which is what this talk is about, of how can you, or even can you, use traditional meditation techniques taken straight out of the Buddhist tradition, the Tibetan in particular, and apply them to emotions and emotion dysregulation and so on, which are at the root of these mood disorders like anxiety and depression. So it's, my whole work is very much around this kind of I move a lot in this kind of space where there's an overlap between Buddhism and science. So I thought I'd just start to get an idea, because sometimes people haven't really heard about it, this idea of contemplative science before, but it's been around for some time. And in fact, really the person who kicked it off was the Dalai Lama, who in the 80s, after he'd won the Nobel Peace Prize, was quite famous, and he was really interested in science, and he realized that he could just hold conferences and invite these scientists who are at the top of their fields, and they would come and have these discussions. And so I'll talk more about that in a moment, but those discussions evolved over time into big worldwide projects that are going on now. And in his presentation of how you would interact, I mean, I can go back to this. I guess some of you are probably interested in this idea that he says, suppose something's definitely proven through scientific investigation that it conflicts with Buddhism, then we have to accept. And what you'll see here is it's kind of a clever statement because there are these things that he's taken on. So there are Buddhist texts that say that, the earth's at the center and that it's flat and all these kinds of things that, we know not to be true. And he's changed them. So sort of those sorts of things in terms of Buddhist psychology and these things that Buddhism is actually all about, right? Which is about sort of removing suffering and so on. Then it's not whether the earth is flat, round, or oblong, it doesn't really matter. So those sorts of things have been taken on board, no problem. But some of the fundamental assertions of Buddhism, as you'll see, are problematic because science can't get at them one way or another, which is what we'll have a look at. So there are these three dimensions that he often talks about. There's scientific, which sometimes you'd hear this called psychological, like Buddhist psychology. And there are these claims about how we interact with the world. It's pretty easy to test them, if you have the time and the interest. There's a philosophical dimension. This is, this sort of truths about reality, if you like. This is where quantum physics maps onto a lot of Buddhist thought quite neatly. And then there's this other religious dimension, which in some time in the future could be looked at scientifically, but for the time being, it's not. It's problematic, and we'll go into why in a moment. But these first two, not. And there's no reason that these two dimensions can't be part of an everyday discussion about, say, mental health, for example, even politics or so on. Anyway, that's what I will talk about. Now, so I mentioned these Mind and Life conferences. That's what they were called back in the 80s. And at this time, they became annual. So every year there were scientists coming to India mostly, and they would talk about anything from physics, emotions, all sorts of different things. There was always different topics. And in fact, the year 2000, there was one called Destructive Emotions, which is a book by Daniel Goleman that's bestseller in New York Times and so on, and is worth a look if you're interested in this sort of crossover in terms of how emotions work, which is a lot of the work I do, of course. And so their mission statement used to be, so that those conferences evolved into the Mind and Life Institute. It was housed at MIT for a long time in the US. It did move, and I'm actually not sure where, but it's got a mind of its own, if you pardon the pun. Like, it's really taken off. There's a Mind and Life Europe. There was a Mind and Life Asia conference tour sometime pre-pandemic that didn't come to Australia. And so this idea of contemplative science, where there's some mix between contemplative traditions and scientific inquiry, is kind of old news. It's been around a long time. It's very well established. There's tens of millions of dollars of funding into these sorts of research worldwide, and really big projects as well. And in the beginning, this is interesting though, it's evolved, and the Mind and Life Institute, this was their mission, part of their mission statement a while back, which was supporting the integration of first-person inquiry through meditation and contemplative practices into traditional scientific methodology. So I found this interesting because that's really controversial in a lot of scientific materialist sort of positions. But it's really admirable in a lot of ways too, to figure out how to get these two together. Anyway, recently, as I had to present this series on Buddhism and science, I went back to try to find that mission statement on their website, and I discovered it's changed. They've actually eliminated this idea. They've reneged, I'll use the word. And now they're talking about bringing science and contemplative wisdom together to better understand the mind and create positive change and so on. But actually, there's nothing in there about really taking the core elements of contemplative practice, whether it's from Christian, Sufi, Buddhist, or wherever it's from, taking those contemplative understandings and approaches and technology and so on and using them, which is disappointing, but that's just part of the world we live in. There is another group who founded by one of the founders of the Mind and Life Institute. His name's Alan Wallace, who's a close teacher of mine. And they've set up a worldwide organization, which is, it says here, to provide ideal conditions for contemplatives, scientists, and philosophers to fathom consciousness and re-envision global flourishing. That's a very the pictures there are there's a center already up and running in Crestone, Colorado, people in long-term retreat. So these people are going to be like full-time. These are professional meditators. They're in retreat full-time for years at a time. There's land already bought in New Zealand, so there's a South Pacific version coming. We're fundraising now for to actually build retreat cabins and scientific research infrastructure and so on. That's in its infancy, and there are others, another one in Italy and so on, coming around. And here's their mission and vision: a conducive environment that for practice, basically meditative practice. Ideal conditions for expert meditators. This is you can hear the scientific language already. The ideal conditions for expert meditators to make replicable discoveries about the nature and potentials of consciousness, and importantly, the opportunity for collaborative research with scientists and philosophers. So this is kind of an exciting project. I only mention it because if you're interested in this sort of thing, these are a couple of organizations I think you should probably look into and get on their mailing list and get some information from them. Their mission and vision, and this is for the Crestone group, this is for the Contemplative Research Center. The spirit of radical empiricism, challenging unquestioned assumptions. You'll see what some of those are soon. We seek to discover the deepest sources of mental health, well-being, and environmental flourishing, grounded in ancient principles of nonviolence and compassion, and to share that knowledge with the world. And so this, full disclosure, this organization have two main research thrusts at the moment, like sort of branches. One is very much about the long-term meditators, and that's coming through. The other one is called the Mental Balance Initiative, which is more about what we call eudaimonia, this sort of idea of kind of genuine happiness, flourishing. It has all sorts of words, and defining it, operationalizing it, developing interventions that will support it, and so on. So it's a very secular side of things, although it draws a lot on contemplative traditions. And that's a really big organization, a lot of researchers. And I'm dabbling with them at the moment. I'm a bit busy with my PhD, but that's part of what I'm working on. Okay, so I hope that's maybe some things that are helpful. Those of you who find this interesting, there are some sources, and of course you can get in touch with me if you're interested in knowing more about what we're going to talk about. So let's have a look. I often say that Buddhism and science have a lot in common in terms of the way their broader methodology. And when people talk about the two, it's usually done from a very scientific position. It's like scientists talking about what we can learn by studying people who, a little bit, and which is useful, but it's not very collaborative. If actually, it's the science, and I think it's fair to say, have not shown a great interest in maybe the discoveries and technology that contemplatives use. They're just more interested in, neurocorrelates and maybe questionnaires that dial down emotional dysfunction and dysregulation and these sorts of things, which are important and frankly is what I'm doing in my research. But there's a whole other realm here. There's a whole other sort of body of knowledge that exists within contemplative traditions that science hasn't really tapped into very much or shown a great deal of interest in, if I'm honest. And there is There is one researcher whose name just escapes me because I wasn't going to talk about her, but she's a great example. She did a lot of research into adverse effects of meditation, and how her research came about. And so I have not paid much attention to it, because whenever I see it in the mainstream media, it's always clickbait, the dark side of mindfulness and all this stuff that just, there's a lot of reasons why it's really pointless paying attention to it. But when I actually heard her speak, and she told the history of it, she had done, as part of her PhD, and she was a neuroscientist, she was investigating some certain effects on long-term meditators, and found that their neural activity was higher than she thought it should be. She found they slept much less. She had a sleep lab. They slept much less than non-meditators and so on. And she was so confused that she didn't publish the data at first. And so she went and started speaking to meditation teachers and saying, well, this is weird because here's what happened. And the meditation teachers across the board, I would have said, or they said to her, yeah, of course, people who meditate a lot don't sleep as much because you don't need to. And people who in long-term retreat, even I can, tell you, even just a few weeks retreat, full time, yeah, you simply don't need to sleep as much for a variety of reasons. And so what this researcher, I'm gonna have to find her name, what this researcher sort of came around to is, well, what other knowledge are these people sitting on that we don't know? And she's had a real push to find out, or unlock, if you like, some of these kind of artifacts of contemplatives that haven't been investigated much from a scientific side. So it's a really exciting sort of aspect of what's going on out there in terms of these dialogues. And it's sort of a breakthrough in as much as it's actually science trying to extract some knowledge and understanding from the contemplative side, rather than just sort of run rats through mazes, which is kind of how a lot of meditators feel when they engage in scientific studies. Is, you're just a sort of subject. Okay, so the point of all that is that what I'm presenting here is, yeah, sure, a combination, or how science and Buddhism are kind of interacting, but very much from a contemplative side, because it's a bias that needs correcting. So that's where I'm headed from, and so that's why I would like to talk here about the way we treat phenomena in Buddhism. Well, there's lots of ways, but here's one way we treat phenomena in Buddhism that maps nicely onto a scientific method. I'll give you some examples. We have the first a type of phenomena called extremely hidden. And this is a type of phenomena, and it's basically a belief based on the testimony of a valid source. So I'll give you these examples. Then that particular fact, or that particular belief, if you get enough logic, reasoning, enough understanding behind it, it becomes what we call hidden or slightly hidden phenomena, which is that I haven't accessed it directly, I can't perceive it, but but it's an inferential cognition, we say. Actually, I can infer, I'm confident that it's right based on reasons and logic. And then finally, you can develop technology. I keep using this word very deliberately. Technology that makes those hidden phenomena manifest, which means that it's actually entirely perceived, it's direct perception. And so for a Buddhist perspective, it would be like this. Causes of suffering, for example. I mean, Buddhism is 100% about, you may have heard of this Four Noble Truths idea, if I can abbreviate them. There's it's idea of understanding suffering, that there are causes and what those causes are, that those causes are removable, and the way you would remove them. This is how it works. So things like the causes of suffering, karma, rebirth, these sorts of things, extremely hidden. There's no way you can sort of know. So you would kind of just have people you have confidence in tell you this, or read it in books and say, okay, I'll believe it. But it's pretty much, what we call extremely hidden. But there are certainly lots of philosophy, lots of text, lots of logical reasonings that can support the ideas. And so when you have that, you do a bit of study, reading, meditation comes into this as well. There are certain types of meditation coming into this as well. Then through that analysis, you say, actually, logically, it makes more sense maybe that this is true than it's not true. Then over time, there's actually technology you would develop. I'd call it contemplative technology, where you can perceive it directly. And you go, oh yeah, right, it's true, or it's not. And it's nicely, it maps well onto, say, historically in science. If you take a Ptolemaic model of the solar system, for example, right, then what we have is the Earth at the center of the solar system and everything else is going around it. Why? Because a valid source, i.e. the Bible, tells us it's like this, right? And make no mistake, science came out of this. Science was Western science was developed by theologians who were Christians and trying to affirm Christian beliefs. And so you're told this, okay, so you've got this extremely hidden phenomenon, which is the setup of the solar system, And with that setup of the solar system, we think, oh, the Earth's in the center because that's what I'm told. Investigate that for a little bit, and there's all sorts of anomalies, and it doesn't matter how many times you come up, attempt to account for these anomalies, it's really problematic. And so what we end up with eventually is, of course, Copernicus shows up and mathematically figures it out. He's like, the whole thing makes sense if only the sun's at the center and the Earth's going around. So now all of a sudden, the makeup of the solar system is what we would call slightly hidden phenomena, which is that it's pretty clear that's right because we can, you can do the math, right? But I can't see it, I can't prove it. And what you would mostly what will take manifest phenomena into this domain of perceivable into manifest phenomena is technology. So in this case, we have Galileo. So Galileo shows up, looks at what's come before him, pretty confident that Copernicus is right. And what he does is this: he develops an 8-power telescope, and with this telescope, he can see the moons of Jupiter in orbit, etc., etc. Many of you would know the story better than me, probably. And it's through the development of this technology that he perceives for himself that, here's how it works. I got the evidence. And not only that, but he can tell other people how to build a telescope. He can have other people look through the telescope. You can replicate these discoveries. And so, now it's not very controversial in most cases that's how it works. Sun's at the center, and we're on this elliptical orbit around the sun. Okay, so this is really important way of thinking in Buddhism. You've got, even though you have these, you're told these things that you're kind of just encouraged to believe in a way. You're only encouraged to believe them in order to test it as a hypothesis. There's no blind faith. So, and here's where, so these two things, I gave you two examples, a Buddhist side and a scientific sort of example of how you would bring these extremely hidden phenomena into this realm of perceivable things, understandable by your own perception. And in both cases, for both, the Buddhism and science, it's done by observing the phenomena that you're trying to understand. So this is a really important part for us, that in order to science and Buddhism both, you want to understand the phenomena from a Buddhist perspective. It's like you want to understand it because it's a way to reduce any dis-ease, any sort of, let's just call it suffering, mental distress, and in order to be of more benefit to your community and the people around you, of course. And you do that by observing how it works, how suffering works, and if there are causes I can remove, and so on. So with that in mind, Buddhism really has never taken much of an interest in the outside world. The technologies that were developed, the understandings that were developed were not really about, how far is the sun from the Earth and is the Earth going around. They really don't feature very heavily. And likewise, for a variety of reasons, we're at this point now, after 400 years of science and let's say 130 years of psychology, that we still have no scientific technology that can directly observe the mind or mental states. This is the situation we're in. So you can see there's sort of there's a time for overlap here, or a possibility for overlap here, that you've got some people who really are good at investigating. They have this technology, and there are types of meditation that do it, that enable you to access the mind, mental states, and so on, and observe them directly without interfering with them and understanding them, in the same way that you have physical technology out there that really does help us in terms of certainly physical health, and all sorts of other technologies that really do improve our external state of being, if you like, our lived experience. the problem, of course, well, we'll come to some of the problems, but here's where we're at. And I already know what some of you are thinking. No, fMRIs and EEGs and all this stuff, but none of those things observe mind or mental states. We can, if you want to talk about that in the discussion later, no worries, but that's just the way it works. Another part of, and we'll come back to this, another part of the way that sort of both systems, if you like, or both traditions work is they've sort of evolved over time. You're not going to go into a Buddhist tenet systems thing. In fact, in the monasteries in Tibet and now in India, there's a study program. It's called a Geshe study program. It takes about 20 to 22 years full-time study to complete. And they spend, I think, 6 years just studying the tenet systems. And they start with non-Buddhist schools. They study all these non-Buddhist philosophical systems and so on. So they really do understand quite a lot of how other people think. And there are these ones in Buddhism that have evolved from a very materialist point of view, such as this one, which really believes in very firm things out there, like subatomic particles that are very, very real, and these sorts of things that don't really fly even with quantum physics. And then there are these schools in ever-increasing subtlety. Similar thing has happened in psychology, that over time, it's an evolved tradition. It's an evolving tradition. And you start even before the 1900s, we got William James, who's, if you've not read William James, I recommend looking him up. I mean, it's like scientific papers are like poetry. It really is quite an incredible piece of work. Then we have sort of Freud shows up. And of course, after Freud, the behaviorists were around the same time. We've got these behaviorists, Watson and Skinner and so on. And what these people did, and I should be clear, and I will go back to James. James was what we call an introspectionist. He actually said, look, we need to understand psychological phenomena. The only way we can understand it is by observing it. So let's try to figure out how we can observe it, which is going to be introspectively. It's going to be, we're going to have to watch our own and try to see if it's replicated amongst others. And so then the behaviorists really went to war on that, and for many, many years dominated psychology by saying that you can only understand anything by studying the behavior, and that there's this black box of mental processes that we can never access and never understand, and it's meaningless to talk about it. It's very analogous to the Spanish Inquisition, so like if you think about Galileo having to recant his, which he did, he recanted his findings on the setup of the solar system. And this was very similar. They really went to war on anyone who said that maybe we could introspectively examine our own minds. And we still live under their influence today. Thankfully, cognitive psychologists showed up around the 70s and 80s, really got going, and the Daniel Kahneman and so on. And while the behaviorists had this idea that there's input and output, and that's all you can control and that's all you can learn, the cognitive psychology really took an interest in the cognitive processes themselves. So well, that's, it gets kind of interesting because we've got this stimulus, we've got the response, but what's going on in the middle? And they kind of intuited that these processes are at the heart of a lot of problems for us. A lot of sort of psychological issues, if you like, and so on. So, which is really interesting, because now you're starting, if you're a Buddhist, if you had done some study in Buddhism, now you're going to look up and take an interest, because it's a shared kind of a way of thinking. That while we have a cognitive psychology, if you want to just oversimplify it, which I'm going to, you have a stimulus, you've got the cognitive processes, and you have a behavior as a result of those processes. And it maps really nicely onto three core sort of types of training in Buddhism, which we call ethics, or ethical discipline, concentration, and wisdom, or understanding. Because the very first part of Buddhist training is, the mental stuff's really hard. The habits are ingrained. It's pretty hard to just change your stereotypes, and it's hard to change your cognitive style and these sorts of things. It's much easier to change your behavior. So start there. And so you get people just, not killing, not stealing, these sorts of really, I want to say generic, because a lot of traditions will have these same ideas, just to agree to reel your behavior in. And it's said that having your behavior kind of a little bit under control, then you're in a position to start to develop concentration. And the concentration is what we would call concentration is to mental states what Galileo's telescope was to the moons of Jupiter. This is the technology that allows us to examine the mind and mental states arising in there. It's through concentration. It's like having higher levels of concentration cuts through that atmospheric distortion of all our preconceptions and so on, in able to examine it correctly. Then once you have that technology, just as you might have a telescope or even a microscope, and then in order to use it, you need to test hypotheses, right? That's what a molecular biologist or an astronomer will do. Then it's the same here. In a contemplative tradition, certainly the Buddhist, you use that concentration to start testing hypotheses. So the mind is like this, mental things happen like this. Suffering arises from this, happiness arises from this, and you test them out. And so that's how these things all kind of they fit together. So when I was just playing around with it a few weeks ago, this stimulus, cognitive processes, behavior thing, and it just dawned on me that actually that's they really work quite nicely in conjunction with a Buddhist point of view. And most importantly is here that it's this interpretation, if you like, between the encountering a stimuli and processing that mentally, cognitively, where the problems arise. And so this is like right on now. Like I say, Buddhism and psychology are right on the same page now, because we agree that this is sort of the issue. This is the interesting part, and it's really uncontroversial. If within neuroscience and cognitive psychology, Buddhism, there is an overwhelming consensus that we never really examine or accurately process all the objects in the outside world, that all we ever get is our own interpretation of that. So there's what's presented to my senses, if you like, and then there's my interpretation of that. And that's all I ever operate on, is exactly that, is my interpretation. And then, so the question sort of arises then, well, how close is my interpretation to the real thing? This is an important question. What sort of interpretations are helpful and what sort of interpretations are harmful is another important question. So, and is the interpretation itself malleable? Can I make changes? So these are the sorts of questions that cognitive psychology, neuroscience, Buddhists, we're all interested in. But we have different methodology to try to examine them. And of course, only the contemplative traditions have the technology to examine them directly. Science has no technology with which they can examine the mind or mental states. So it's problematic. I sometimes play around with this. I don't want to take too much time on it. These idea of cognitive biases are really common if you just read those out loud to yourself. Out those sentences, if I remove a word from each of them and you read them again, some of you will have got it, but some of you wouldn't. That the mind really does just make up a lot of our reality. It's that interpretation, but it kind of the mind, in this case the brain, is predictive. Your reality is built on what the brain expects to have happen based on prior experience. And there's other ways you can sort of play around with this. I think maybe there's called a Stroop effect. Maybe you can, I'll give you a chance. In a moment, I'm going to put some words up and I'll give you a minute or so. And here's the task. The task is to just is to say the font. So here's a test. In this case, you would say red, orange, blue, purple for the first line. And for the second line, you would say red, purple, blue, orange. Okay. And if I just have a go at it, I was just briefly at home, just give me the color of the font. So again, if you start from, the first two lines are easy enough, right? Red, blue, yellow, purple, yellow, blue, green, red. And then the third line there, of course, is green, red, purple, blue, and so on. And what most of you will have found is that you sort of really slow down trying to say that. Again, this is because we have these cognitive biases that we've learned to read words rather than be interested in the color of them, because it's the things that are the most important to us, that we've been told are the most important things, get priority and they get processed more quickly. The brain sets up faster neural networks, and it's really hard to enact what we call second or third order responses because we have all these habits. And so psychology has some really clever, fun ways of explaining or examining different aspects of these cognitive biases that we're talking about. And back test is another one. So it's not a there's a lot of overlap here. There's this idea that all we have is our interpretation, and that interpretation is sometimes problematic, is really neatly maps onto, like I say, neuroscience, cognitive psychology, Buddhism, and others. But as I've mentioned, we struggle with the technology from the scientific side, from the psychology side, to examine this in detail. So, but it's not like they haven't tried, and it's not like they're not coming up. They are coming up with really, really clever and quite subtle ways of examining it. I just burned through a few examples there. So it's a like there's an ongoing kind of effort on all sides. It's just that one side, in this case, the scientific side, is lacking the technology. So I'd like to really briefly go through how this technology looks, or what it looks like, and when you look at this word meditation. So remember now, I'm talking about contemplative technology. That is technology that brings things from slightly hidden to manifest phenomena that you can perceive directly. And you need technology to do it. That technology is meditation. In, say, Sanskrit and Tibetan and Pali, these sorts of source languages in Buddhism, then the word that we translate as meditation translates much more accurately as cultivation or familiarization. There's a really broad, across the board misunderstanding of meditation in the West, and certainly among researchers of meditation. I think that's fair to say that it really has this idea of familiarizing and cultivating certain mental traits, if you like. And even then, so that's at the top of the ladder there, but even then there are different types. There is a type of, say, placement meditation, which is this mindfulness and introspection. This is really single-pointed focus, and even then it divides into more most likely focused attention, but there are other types. So you've got, and in certainly the Tibetan tradition, this is not true in all Buddhist traditions. In the Tibetan tradition, they really divide these up. This placement meditation is something that you train in very intensely first, and then having done that, which is to say develop the technology to observe the mind, you shift over and start testing hypotheses. And that's what, say, analytical meditation is like. I've heard it called deconstructive, which I quite like. It means analyzing our sense of self and lived experience in the world and breaking it down to see what's really there. There's also this other idea of, say, cognitive or constructive, which is looking at cultivation of kindness and compassion and these sorts of pro-social mental states. Okay. So this is how it sort of looks. If you're looking for a suite of technologies that one might use in order to sort of make a push for controlling your own mental health, for example, which is what Buddhism is all about, then here they are. The left-hand side of what you're looking at there would be sort of developing the telescope or the microscope, if you like, that can sort of hone in on certain things and reduce the noise in the data, we would say. In some cases, if you take it to really extraordinary high levels, that placement meditation really will eliminate all, I shouldn't say eliminate, it will temporarily suspend a lot of those cognitive biases. And a really nice analogy that, although it's dated now, would be, say, like sending the Hubble telescope up to orbit the Earth. So in order to examine the stars more closely, you just want to get free of all the atmospheric distortion. So what do you do? Well, you launch a telescope up to orbit the Earth, so you don't have that atmospheric distortion. You get a better look. And that's a really good analogy to what a lot of these meditation practices or meditation technology is for, is to be able to really focus and not get caught up and sucked into all these biases and so on, which are much of our lived experience. And then having done that, you shift over to this sort of discursive side where you start doing these analytical meditations and so on, which are testing hypotheses about how you exist in relation to others, and so on. This is pretty complicated, high-end philosophy we don't really have time for. Okay, so I like to come back to, because there's one really glaring omission here. There is one really serious issue that is going to be uncomfortable, and I don't want to harp on about it because I don't, like I said, I'm not here, I don't have any real agenda, but I would like to point out a couple of things. To come back to William James, so William James got really interested in the brain. This is a pre-neuroscience, and he came up with 3 hypotheses about how it works. The brain produces thoughts the way electric current produces light. Here's one. The brain enables, probably the kind of most poetic, interesting one is this one. The brain enables or permits mental events as the trigger of a crossbow releases an arrow by removing the obstacle that holds the string, which is just, this guy was a thinker. And finally, we have this, the brain transmits thoughts as a prism transmits light, refracting it into a spectrum of colors, in which case, of course, the brain comes after the mind, which is an interesting hypothesis. Okay. If you put it into this way of thinking, right, this idea of types of phenomena, well, you can go with the sort of first option. Say, okay, consciousness and mental disorders and so on arise from the brain. Okay, so that's extremely hidden, valid of a testimony of a valid source, I should say, in this case, neuroscientists, of course. And so you think, well, how might I know? How might I know if this is true or not? And you think, well, one evidence, but it's not very conclusive, would be pharmacological sort of solutions to depression and anxiety and so on. But it's not very conclusive. In fact, the pharmacology itself gives reason to think that is not true for a variety of reasons, which we can come to in a moment. And then, of course, even if you do come to the conclusion, well, consciousness is definitely arising from the brain, everything's coming out of the brain, the pharmacology is good enough, even then, you can't quite bring it into this manifest realm because there's no technology to test those assumptions, which is problematic. Okay. There's a bigger problem, of course, that there's no real interest in testing them, certainly not in neuroscience. And what we end up with is basically the field of psychology and neuroscience sort of mostly operating on untested belief, which is where we're at. And I want to stop and pause and say, even though that's the case, they're doing all sorts of great stuff. So I'm not sort of, it sounds harsher than it really needs to be. That, you know, in the meantime, people are really getting benefit from all sorts of solutions, including pharmacology, in relation to all sorts of mental distress. But it's kind of almost as good as it gets. We're not going to get much further unless we really understand what's going on and what the source of these cognitive styles, the source of these mental activity actually comes from. And one of the, in terms of this hypothesis of perhaps the brain refracts the mental activity the way a prism reflects, that is to say, that kind of mediates consciousness from somewhere else through the brain into the world, and from the world through the brain to something else, i.e. the mind, then the most common sort of response, certainly from neuroscientists, is, well, no, because non-physical things can't affect physical things. Which, you know, I'm not going to go into it, but if you're familiar with the double slit experiment and all these sorts of things, then the fact is that isn't true. And in fact, it's high school science now that non-physical things do affect physical things. And it's not even worth arguing about, because if neuroscientists should basically just pick up the phone and call the physics department, and then we could be done with it. There's a really wonderful TED talk by Donald Hoffman, who himself is a neuroscientist, who says himself, you know, just to finish it up, there says, those insights are out there for us to use, and yet my field, that is neuroscience, says, we'll stick with Newton, thank you, we'll stay 300 years behind in our physics. So this Do We See Realities is a TED talk I would highly recommend checking out. I have a lot of time for this guy. There's some other really interesting people who've said that. Galileo, I came across this recently. Useful as it is under everyday circumstances to say the world exists out there independent of us, that view can no longer be upheld. There's a strange sense in which this is a participatory universe. Sorry, this is John. I'm reading the wrong thing. Isn't that interesting? I think that taste, odors, colors reside on consciousness. Hence, if the living creature were removed, all these qualities would be annihilated. This is Galileo getting involved in cognitive psychology 400 years before anyone else did. And then the next one, which I accidentally read from my notes. Here we are. Useful as it is under everyday circumstances to say the world exists out there independent of us, that view can no longer be upheld. There's a strange sense in which it's a participatory universe. Again, you know, quantum physicist and theorist John Wheeler, you'll find him all over the place. Actually, really well worth your time investigating him. So here's basically where we're at, that we're kind of in a situation where we do understand that as our interpretation of the world around us is causing us difficulties and problems. It's causing unhappiness, it's causing depression, it's causing anxiety, it's causing conflict between neighbors and nation states, actually. And we don't have the technology to examine it in order to understand it better and maybe kind of bring about some kind of revolution in the mind sciences, which has never happened, basically. You know, we've had these revolutions in, say, Galileo is in terms of science. You got Galileo, this revolution in science. Darwin, a revolution, you know, in science. Quantum physics, revolution, or theory of relativity, if we back up a bit. These are like real revolutions in science. And the mind science is yet to have any of these sorts of revolutions that really kind of bring it in, you know, like sort of rewrite how we think about our mind and our mental states. So I think that's probably close to enough. I do have some more. If people are interested, we can come back to say how sort of the DSM, how psychology is dealing with this. So I'm happy to talk about that. I did bring this along, and I'll play it now that I've got it up in front of me. It's a nice little piece that kind of demonstrates this idea about how we are not just sort of taking in the world out there and sort of correctly sort of perceiving it and accessing it, that in actual fact, there's this predictive element to what's happening in our whole reality. And to some degree, a large degree, we're sort of making it up, if you like, based on our prior experience, that our whole world is interpreted. Right? As I said, this is really uncontroversial in lots of philosophy and neuroscience and so on, but our whole world is interpreted, and that it's that type of interpretation that is at the cause of difficulties and some of our suffering. And so then what I'd like to finish with this then is to talk really finally in terms of mental health, which is, you know, the area that I move in, is why some of this is so important, or why, you know, for me, I find so much of this so important, is because in terms of, we've been using for a long time using a medical model to try to understand mental health, and it hasn't worked, and it's not working. And that's because the system works like this. If you have let's say in the 80s, those of us are old enough to remember this, you know, when AIDS first appeared, then what we had is an autoimmune deficiency syndrome. What that means, what this word syndrome means, and there might be some healthcare professionals here, so yes, I'm oversimplifying. What that word means is there's clusters of symptoms that are the same, but we don't know the cause. That's what syndrome is. And then eventually you investigate, you research, you pour all this time and effort into it, and then you discover the cause, in this case, the HIV virus, right? You've got this virus. Okay, so now the syndrome becomes a disease. And that disease, the thing about a disease is you have some idea of the cause, which means you can develop treatments, right? The DSM-5, the latest version of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, that certainly in Australia and the United States and some other countries use almost exclusively to make diagnoses about mental health or mental illness. In amongst all of these, there isn't one single mental disease. Just to make really clear that in the whole world of dealing with, you know, and trying to treat mental disorders and syndromes, that's what it's actually, in fact, that's why I had that slide up. Maybe I should just put it back really quickly, is that, here we go, that when you're defining what a disorder is in the DSM, it's a clinically significant behavior, psychological syndrome or pattern. That is to say, the syndrome, there's this, and I've abbreviated, associated with distress or blah, 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 all these things. And so the point being here that every single, you know, mental illness, if you like, that's treated pharmacologically or perhaps through therapy and so on, or combinations thereof, no psychologist anywhere knows the cause. And because you don't know the cause, can't develop treatments. And so without, you know, you say, well, yeah, there are treatments, but these treatments are really hit and miss. We have SSRIs and these sorts of things. It's like you've got, say, antidepressant medication, and it works for some people with depression and not others. Some people with anxiety, it works for them, but not for their depression. And the anxiolytics work for people with depression, but not anxiety. It's all over the place. And even if they do work, they only work for 6 to 12 months and they have to be changed, which is maybe come up again in a discussion. But that medication has to be changed. Why? Because it's not addressing the root cause. And this is not controversial. I'm just sort of quoting any honest abnormal psych lecturer at any university in the country, including Sydney University, which is where I first learned this. There aren't mental diseases because we don't know the cause. So it's possible, I'm putting it out there, that perhaps we're looking in the wrong place. I'm going to put even further and say that perhaps there are some people we could ask who might know. And in fact, those people might be part of traditions that have actually known for thousands of years. But we're not asking them and we're not looking there. And even when we approach them, it's done on our terms. It's not really been done from this idea of what do contemplatives know that we might be able to take and see if we can replicate and understand better in order for treatment for the mental health of ourselves and our community and the world in general. And I think we can probably call it there. Yeah, Akiva?
To access other videos and podcasts in this series, go to the Philosophy Resources section of the Rational Realm website at www.rationalrealm.com.